Hello and welcome to The Drum. I'm Sarah Dingle. Coming up, Indigenous leaders question why more isn't being done to stop high rates of domestic violence. Indigenous leaders say they're frustrated by the lack of progress on reducing violence towards women and children in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. A Productivity Commission report out today shows rates of Indigenous family and community violence haven't changed in 15 years, and Indigenous women and girls are 32 times more likely to be hospitalised after a domestic assault. 3 Indigenous leaders, including our panellist Josephine Cashman, told the National Press Club the federal government wasn't doing enough to help Indigenous women and children break free from physical and sexual violence.
I call upon the federal, state and territory governments to take this matter more seriously, to ensure the safety of Aboriginal women and children by upholding their human rights. I call upon the federal government to do what has been done in light of Aboriginal youth in detention and hold a royal commission into the countless homicides, acts of violence and sexual abuse perpetrated against this country's most marginalised.
The Productivity Commission tells us today that 24 out of 1,000 programs have been evaluated. That's shocking by any standard. And so that tells us that not only is there no evaluation, there's no evidence and there's no policy.
Well, Josephine Cashman, first to domestic violence. You told the National Press Club today that effectively Aboriginal women are still living as second-class citizens. Who is failing to protect these women?
Well, thanks for having me. I don't want to get anyone in trouble, but clearly there's a lack of response, and I've been told by senior people that there are blockages in the bureaucracy and in some ministers' offices and ministers' advisors around implementing change. This is horrific statistics, and basically, if people don't act, they've certainly got the blood of Aboriginal women and children on their hands. This has to be taken seriously as a national priority.
Where are these blockages coming from, though? Why is there a reluctance to do anything?
Marcia talked about people who've drunk Kool-Aid and don't want to face the fact that we do have a crisis of law and order in Aboriginal communities that need to be effectively policed. I mean, the National Action Plan actually in its preamble suggests a 2-tiered legal system where victims of rape and child sexual assault and violence can go into mediation. I mean, it's really risky business. I spoke at the full Human Rights Council and they had a special historic session on violence against Indigenous women, and Australia was supporting a motion put forward by Canada to take this seriously. But I don't see it actually being taken as seriously as it should. And I can point to examples of that, and I did it in the Press Club, and so did Marcia and Jacinta.
Well, you're on the Prime Minister's Indigenous Advisory Council, of course. How long have you been raising the alarm on these issues, and what's been the response?
Oh, ever since I started, and I've been chair of the Safe Community Subcommittee for the last 18 months. I mean, people actually didn't want to face this issue. It's fundamental in a democracy that people live in an environment where they're free of violence and sexual abuse, and it's the core of lots of different issues. I pointed to the Crime Commission report, which was covert and overt operations from 2006 to 2014 that hasn't been released. Certainly the response has been pretty much radio silence, and we're living in some sort of weird policy vacuum.
And do you think there's a role that political correctness is playing in that radio silence?
Well, I think people are scared and confused, but think about the people in the communities and women who are in fear for their lives. I mean, that is a really good, sound foundation for separate policy thinking in Indigenous affairs around violence. I'll give you an example. In the worst affected areas in the Northern Territory, there are 19 adults and children per room. In that situation, there is, you know, some sort of argument for safe houses in some communities. I've spoken about this and you know, people refusing to listen and say, well, the woman should stay in their home no matter what. Well, that might be great for a middle-class woman in a suburb, and we support that, but it's not, there is a good argument for proper policy development in this area, and we are living in some sort of weird policy vacuum, which I don't understand, and the leaders I work with don't understand, and we've got a national network now. We don't understand. It's such a serious issue. As a country, yes, political correctness is getting in the way. People want to focus on Aboriginal men in jail, but the reality is, for example, over 50% of Aboriginal males in jail in the NT are there for acts to cause harm. The next most common offences are sexual assault and then traffic. The Forest Review has specified policy suggestions around those traffic offences. They can be easily implemented, but the reality is not everybody's in there for unpaid fines.
Josephine, can I ask a question?
Sure.
I mean, clearly the top-down approach of programmatic responses isn't really taking into account the complex issues that are in a really diverse community. How do you actually empower the communities to have more control and more say in actually what happens in their own environments? I mean, how do you do that?
Well, firstly, how can you have that sort of evidence-based response if only 34 of 1,000 programs is actually evaluated? How do we know what's working and what's not? I mean, it's just, it's extraordinary. I couldn't believe the Productivity Commission. Secondly, law and order, unless you want to set up an Aboriginal police force, is a state and territory responsibility. Yes, communities should be in control of their destiny and individuals should be in control of what they want to do in their life. But at the moment, people are saying, oh, the community's got to agree. There's an example that I gave recently in a speech in a community in East Gippsland, and I was actually involved through a family member, and the police wouldn't go and protect a woman in need because they had to go to an elders council before they entered the trust property. I mean, that's completely ridiculous. You've got to separate these issues. One's a human rights issue and another one's a development agenda.
Josephine, I'd like to say one thing to you. I'd like to say thank you very much for your advocacy and honesty today, and the statistics you show us are devastating, absolutely devastating and terrible. One tiny thing I'd ask you about or make a contribution on is it's quite hard for Australians in cities to know what the circumstances are in remote Aboriginal communities, and my newspaper invests a lot of money in sending reporters to get there. When I've been to a few communities myself, I've been astonished at how obviously ineffective some government programs are. I had the pleasure a few years ago of visiting Hopevale, and there's not a tarred road between Hopevale and Cooktown. So there's all this federal government program stuff in Hopevale, but nobody's spent a few $1 million to tar the roads. So when the winter rains come, people can go to town. Now, it seems to me, apart from all the devastating stuff you're telling us, this Productivity Commission revelation that 34 out of 1,000 programs are properly evaluated just goes to the heart of a massive failure. I mean, I'm just wondering what you think about that, really.
I absolutely agree with you. And in the Press Club speech, there are solutions there. Well, we have to look at the DFAT's agenda and their investment in the Asia Pacific. I mean, they've got a program where 80% of their funding, and that's even infrastructure funding, has to empower women and girls. They've got a very sophisticated monitoring framework. If we can do it outside our country, why can't we do it inside our country?
On that, I want to bring in Sam Crosby here. 34 evaluated organisations out of 1,000 in an area where the government's spending $30 billion. Why wouldn't you want to scrutinise the outcomes when we scrutinise other areas of government spend very, very heavily?
Well, it's a very good question. Of course you should. You know, the answer is of course you should. There's, you know, abject failure on this on both sides of the parliament, all the way going back for years and years. But I'd like Josephine to follow up. I mean, what are the sort of specific? I saw one of the criticisms of these programs, they were woolly. What are some of the specific, tangible things that any government can be looking at here? Because I think that's where we all sort of fall down. For all the good intentions in the world, we don't necessarily nail it down and say, here are the 5 things that we absolutely need to look at.
Okay, well, when you're talking about law and order, we need to equip our police so that they can work effectively in Aboriginal communities. It's a very tough environment. They have a high turnover in remote communities, and I must say violence does happen in communities like La Perouse. I did when I was a prosecutor, a big domestic violence case there, and there is violence in urban communities too. But it's training the police effectively, supporting victims of crime, supporting behavioural change programs for men, so you change social norms. And a clear example of that, and where we've been ignored, is Charlie King's No More campaign. In a community in Arnhem Land, they've implemented the No More campaign as across the community, and that's where they've developed a domestic violence action plan. There's been a 70% reduction in domestic violence call-outs for police, and that's been, the police have actually given those statistics, and these are the worst affected areas, Raminginnings, that community. And I've spent the last 18 months trying to get some support for Charlie King on that program. That is a grassroots program, and they've ignored it. And it's not that difficult to get programs now where you can monitor data. It's just a complete failure. And there are solutions out there, and they are driven by people like Charlie King from the community. And there are some very good Aboriginal organisations where we could learn best practice, but nobody's properly evaluating it. No one's using evidence and science. I mean, that goes out the window for Aboriginal affairs, doesn't it?